All right, if you are here for Squid Game, I love you. Can I just ask you to get a little closer to the front? Okay, so come closer because it's a small crowd tonight. So everyone move one level up so that we can all be in this together. There was someone who I asked to come closer and he left. So that makes, don't leave if you don't want to go closer, but just come closer. Yeah, we're one family, one mishpacha, as we say. Welcome. I spilled that fruit fly thing all over my hand, so it just fell on me and it smells really gross. So I'm just gonna put it over this for a second, hopefully that makes it better. Welcome y'all, so we're gonna keep this program a little bit on the shorter side, probably 45 minutes tops, because it's a little bit later, and some of you I know have actually been here earlier. Are you here? Oh, cool, all right, awesome. That's Kojin, we just hired Kojin, our new events associate. Welcome, Manny's. Very excited that you're here. Give yourselves a round of applause. Oh, this is the guy who got left because I said you were closer. He didn't leave. He's still here. Welcome back. We're going to skip the intros for a second of introducing yourself to the person around you because I just decided that's what we're going to do, but I want to say welcome. This is a topic that I'm really excited about. You know what? Without further ado, let's bring our professors up to the stage. Welcome. So I'll watch it. Welcome. Hello. Hi. Okay. First of all, you have your mics are right next to you.
Professors on the stage.
Professors on the stage. I love talking to professors. So can you please tell us, I said this to you outside, but what do you profess? So what is it that you teach at Berkeley? Let's start with you, Professor.
Okay, my name is Kevin. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This will be fun. I teach Korean literature and culture at Berkeley, so mostly literature. I'm not really a film or media person, kind of officially or professionally, but I'm interested. I watch all of these things. But
you do.
I teach literature.
Awesome. How long have you been teaching Korean literature and film?
Well, actually, this is my first semester, so. I just started, yeah.
Awesome.
I finished my degree in 2019 and I've been kind of teaching jobs on and off the last few years.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for doing this and being here tonight. And do you want me to say Professor Smith or you're Professor Smith?
Professor Smith? I'm just calling
Ian and Kevin. Okay, all right. We'll skip the honorifics, just cut the crap and just go straight to the names. Ian. And you said yes to this, I think, yesterday.
Yeah, it was a pretty quick turnaround here, but I'm actually quite excited because I profess on issues of global media and international flows of media. My specialization, my area, is how non-American media gets into the United States and whether it does. In particular, I'll tell you this just to humanize me here. I'm not just a professor, but I was a student at one point. And I was a student around looking at graduate school around the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And one of the things that struck me was I'm getting a lot of information from Fox News and CNN and no information from the region. And so I became curious about like Al Jazeera. Where is that? I know it's out there, but I have to go seek it out. And so I was really, we're in good company here. I was anti-war. I didn't really have a strong feeling that Iraq.
You can say that.
Yeah, I was in good company. Nobody's going to come up here and attack me.
You're not pro-war,
right? Yeah. So my thinking was, why is it? Why do we have no media from outside the United States? Why is there's just a parade of former generals that are on CNN telling me about after we win, this is what it's going to look like. The anti-war sentiment, though defining substantially more than the 3% that were on TV, the anti-war sentiment was just not there. The information about the actual political conditions and the cultural conditions in the Middle East, not there. So I became very curious about how foreign media, it's out there, why don't we see it? Why don't we have access to it? Now, unfortunately, I am not an expert on Korean media in particular. It's just I teach global media and globalization. And so I end up kind of moonlighting a little bit and just dropping in, parachuting in and leaving. So the students and I just do this world tour, in the most bourgeois way possible. And so I'm excited today because I've gotten a glimpse of the kind of fantastic literary tradition and emerging cinematic tradition, from Korea and K-Wave media. And I'm excited because I'd like Kevin to outline some of the blank spots in my head about Korean media. So excited.
Amazing. So let's just dig into it. So I watched it. Did we all watch it? Because we're gonna do some spoilers. If you have a problem with spoilers, then I'm sorry that you have a problem with spoilers. We're gonna get into it. I feel traumatized by it. I do regret watching it because I feel like there was so much in it that I'm never going to be able to unsee. But I also, as a student of politics and as a practitioner of politics, I'm also kind of excited that somebody that deals so deeply with themes of inequality and capitalism and politics can reach the mainstream in such a zeitgeisty way. So I'm excited to dig into all those aspects of it. But the first question is, would you have joined the Squid Game?
Absolutely not. I think that's the lesson at the end of Ki-hoon, our main character, right at the end, he turns around from the getting on the what do you call it,
The jet
boarding the
bridge.
plane,
Yeah.
jet bridge. He wants to take revenge on that. So I think that there's a clear moral. No one should have to participate.
But I guess the deeper sense of the question, it's a jokey question, but actually the deeper meaning of it is, can you imagine if you were in a situation like they were, could you kind of get the sense that, yikes, I guess if I had been that deeply in debt, I probably would have, if I had felt that desperate, I could have likely have gone back into the game, or do you think you couldn't even get to that place of empathy, or
I mean, of course, the deeper kind of meaning is that the real world is the game, right? And that there is no sort of escape, that we're all already playing this game, and that's what the real world kind of society is. And we don't really have a choice, right? Whether we play or we don't, it's kind of like you die or you're kind of socially kind of function, participant in our society. So I think that I took your question quite literally, to be honest, but.
yeah. Well, that's kind of, I want to start with whether or not you both feel like it was a fair critique of capitalism, because in some ways, it clearly shows the kind of surface level reaction is this is so fucked up. Like, no one should have to be this in debt. No one should have to, fight to the death to extricate themselves from this kind of financial serfdom. But then, upon further analysis, there are some things that happen in the show that really, some people are saying, aren't fairly critiquing capitalism. That in real life, the strongest or the most cunning or the most, whatever, they succeed. But in the show, they give the person who actually wins the game is this person who's kind of like nice to everyone and a little bit jolly and rejects it at the, throughout the game. There's the whole repetition of good rich people fighting bad rich people. You mentioned at the end, after he's made all this money, now he's going to go in and save the day. And that whole kind of benevolent philanthropist is very much part of what furthers capitalism today. So do you feel like it did a good job critiquing capitalism, and where do you think it missed the mark?
Yeah, Kevin and I were talking about this as we were discussing the film. I don't want to say that it's not a good critique of capitalism, but my takeaway from it is that what we see here is a portrait of a society without empathy. This is the kind of broader portrait. We do see examples of empathy, no doubt, but the story seems to me about empathy. And of course, debt, capitalism, as much as debt does play a role in a critique of capitalism, capitalism doesn't have a monopoly on debt. That is, has a long history. Committing violence to preserve yourself or to obtain resources, again, not something that is specific to capitalism. So is this a narrative about capitalism? I think the show makes a great deal of it. It tries to wear that on its sleeve, and it does want us to draw those connections between the capitalist system in which we have indentured class, essentially, that's willing to endure dehumanization, humiliation. We see the slap across the face, right? This was the moment, like, they're testing to see whether or not you have the desperation to get into this situation. But is it really a metaphor for the dystopian reality that we're all living? No, we're all watching this. And this is, again, something we were talking about beforehand. We all, all of us have seen it. Well, most of us have seen it.
Except for him.
Yeah, right. Sorry for the spoiler alerts, buddy. But yeah, all of us who are watching this are watching it on a transnational commercial platform. We're paying for this. People are being paid to do it. And do we see a substantial critique of labor? We see it fleetingly. We see, of course, Ali at one point, is fighting his foreman, trying to get his wages. And we have the horrific scene of the hand exploding in the lathe, the industrial equipment. We hear, a recollection of the strikes and how the Korean cops came down on the strike. So it's there in fleeting glances. But as soon to be, bearded, curmudgeonly old Marxist, I don't think that this is a substantial critique of the structures of exploitation. This is more an example of people in a place of desperation. And yeah, we've got rich people in there enjoying the spectacle, just like we are. We are also sitting there watching this, enjoying the hand exploding. We're sitting there picking and choosing winners and losers. Who do we want to win? Oh, well, that guy seems innocent. Oh, that guy showed remorse for that. So those people are the ones that should live. Oh, that banshee of a woman, and she's, she had sex at some point. So I feel like I can. Oh, she manipulated people, so I can see if she dies. That's good. I'm rooting for her. We had horses in that game too, and they made that quite explicit. I think when they showed, I get excited. Sorry.
No. This is good. This is good.
But there's this moment where I think the audience is forced to recognize that we are the VIPs to a certain degree. We're in that spectator position as well. So what does that say? Are we part of the show? Is the show about us? Is our participation in watching the show, and what's the word? Does it make us complicit? That's it. Are we complicit? And perhaps if that is the intention of the show, good on you. Because how many people did we step over to get here today? How complicit are we? Hey, I'm sorry to be the bummer. My show is for kids.
Okay, I think Bram made my mic a little too high. I don't know what's going on, but I appreciate the sound engineering. But we're not killing people. Like, yes, there's a certain amount. Thank you. There's a certain amount of it where we are voyeurs, but it's a little unfair. I mean, we're not like. I did not enjoy watching the people get blown up. Did you guys? No. It's just a show. Yeah, but it was. I mean, I actually think one of the destructive things about the show is that it, like, by the end of it, like the first episode when you're watching Green Light, Red Light, you're like, holy fuck! Like, that is crazy. By the end, where they're falling through the tempered glass, you're like, like that hurt, like that sucks. But like, it's crazy over like nine of you, like what we become acceptable to in terms of violence is insane. I want to go there, but real quick, I want to ask you because, and in talking to my friends about this, one of my friends is Korean, and she was talking about how there's a whole genre of this kind of meta, hyper-violent TV series and film series in Korean and Japanese culture. Is that true? What is that about? And where does this particular kind of series fit into that? Is it just as gory and violent? Is it less, more? Kind of? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, for those of you who are familiar with K-horror or J-horror, Korean or Japanese horror, that horror genre, this show may actually seem somewhat, I guess, in comparison. I mean, I'm not personally a horror person, really, but I don't understand for it. But I mean, I think that like kind of sensational violence, over the top gore and stuff. I mean, this is common in other genres. I think that this show is unique in kind of combining that element, that kind of like horror, violent, gory element with, social critique, or social realist type series or programs, there hasn't really been any, I think, attempt to combine these two genres before. So I think it's unique and successful for that reason. That typically Korean media tends to gravitate either towards like social realism, in which there's very little violence. It's much more, there's like betrayals and things like this, and people end up dying, but that's not really the draw of it, right? It's not the kind of spectacle of action or violence that gets people to watch it. Or then like there's the kind of horror action genre, and sort of the sole purpose of watching it is this. So I think Squid Game was able to combine those two, and it sort of pleases both audiences, I suppose, and that may be why also internationally it did well, because from what I know, even like Korean or Japanese horror tends to be very successful within a kind of niche market in the United States and abroad. But social realism drama not really, and so the fact that it's able to kind of work with both of those genres may have contributed to its overseas success as well.
And thank you for that context. Do you agree with Ian that it actually isn't a very substantial critique of capitalism, and his whole exposition that he just did, which was amazing, but do you agree with him?
Yeah, I think that Ian's explanation is very helpful, but I also like, when you were asking earlier about like the ending and kind of becoming only when he's empowered through his bank account that he can use it, that there are these ways. I think we should take a step back, and not expect like the sort of beginning, middle, and end, like sort of the narrative arc or whatever to like provide some kind of answer as to what we should do, right? And it's not like sort of programmed for how are we going to resist these inequalities that we're seeing. So in that sense, I think you're right that it is sort of there's a failed opportunity there for deeper critique or sort of deeper lines of or kind of a blueprint for action. But I don't know if that's necessarily the intention, or even is it productive to kind of like read our works in terms of that expectation. But one thing in addition to what Ian was saying, that like labor exploitation is invisible, I think that's a great observation. At the same time, I think one of the reasons why the show was so resonated with so many Korean viewers, as well as I think in the United States, is the fact that it's picking up on a kind of like post-work environment, right? Where basically like people aren't even employed, like they don't even have the opportunity to be exploited anymore, right? It's really it's picking up on an environment in which unemployment is like more pressing, or being in debt is more pressing than kind of like the woes or the troubles that you experience at work, right? These people don't even, all of these people choose to participate in the game because they have no recourse to other types of employment, right? And that's, I think, precisely the predicament we find ourselves in today globally.
With the exception of Ali, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to also talk about the importance of Ali's character, because it's something that is talked about in Korea, but it's a different kind of conversation than, let's say, a country like America, which is a nation of immigrants. And while we wrestle with that fact, it seems some people, I don't know how, but some people still don't want to admit that that is our country's founding creed, but that's a whole different thing. But can you talk a little bit about the importance of Ali's character in the show and in Korea and Korean zeitgeist? Or both of you, I guess.
I was actually, Ian and I were talking about this earlier, but I think one of the reasons why this question is important to me, whereas perhaps the reception in the United States hasn't picked up on this so much. I think you, as Manny very correctly pointed out, we're already a kind of multicultural, country, and we're, like you said, the country is built on immigrant labor and so forth, so that's like kind of very familiar to us. But in Korea, and I haven't really seen the importance of Ali's character picked up on in any media, because I think for the American audiences, it's just not, the composition of South Korean society isn't really what's at stake for audiences, right? Like they the show was successful because it resonates with a lot of American concerns about unemployment or debt or right, social welfare and so on. But I think that Ali's character is very important because it's really breaking the stereotype of the Korean homogeneous society. That this is very, I think, powerful kind of like myth or ideology that persists in South Korea today, and kind of making immigrant labor, which is rising. You have a lot of workers from South Asia, Pakistan. Ali's character is meant to be from Pakistan, and also from Southeast Asia. So like it's not hard to find these people in Korean society, and yet in media representation and so on, they're basically ignored. They pretend, the kind of mainstream Korean society pretends that these people don't exist. And so, as far as I know, this is really the first really successful popular media series that has drawn attention to the immigrant experience and the kind of like special difficulties of oppression or whatever these people are facing, and different levels of discrimination and efforts to assimilate. He tries really hard to speak proper Korean and so forth, even kind of he's like too formal, he's over the top kind of formality. So I mean, I think his character is very, very important in representing the multi-ethnic composition of South Korean society that's otherwise disregarded.
Okay, let's get into why this show was so popular. You touched on it already a little bit, Kevin. But why do you think it has touched such a chord globally? I think it was 111 million Netflix subscribers have viewed the show, which is an insane amount. I believe it's one of the most, if not the most viewed series on Netflix. And this is, a media company that has invested billions of dollars in very big budget things. And yet this particular game, in Korean-based, Korean language game show has reached this height. So why do you think that is? And then again, and in addition, why are Americans so obsessed with the show? So why don't we start with you, Ian?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I did an informal poll of my students, asking them if they had seen the show. And I, of course, in media studies, I do this a fair amount because it'd be nice to be able to say, "Oh, has everybody seen this? Oh, everybody's seen it. Okay, we can talk about it. We can analyze certain things." But I've had enough teaching now where it's like less and less people are watching the same things. Like 10 years ago, when I first started asking this question, when I first started teaching, you can rely on 70% of the people having seen a show and then kind of work with that. But now at best, it's 30%, maybe 20%. This show hit like 70%. So yeah, it's resonating, and it's resonating with at least college students in my very non-scientific poll. So why? And I wonder, I probed them a little bit, what their interest was and what they liked about it. And I didn't get any good information from them. I didn't really, but so I'm forced to speculate here. And I do think the class themes, here I am up here being like, real Marxists wouldn't find this to be a substantial critique. Where's wage labor in this? Like, give me a break. Nobody wants to hear about wage labor. It's in 1955, right? But I think that the themes, you're right, debt, right? Maybe labor isn't there, but debt, everybody's familiar with debt. And college students are familiar with debt. Most of us are familiar with debt, and that's something that's a very identifiable problem that the system, capitalism, is producing at this point. And so I would say that yes, the themes, even if it's not what so maybe a traditional or old school socialist might require of critique, it's still heartening to see that people are looking at the issues of the disenfranchised. And again, we're not just talking about capitalism, but the issues of North Korea, the immigrants, Pakistan, like what role do they have in society? All of these major social themes are coming up. But I think that it really resonates with and I take heart in this, with a critique of capital, even if it isn't substantial in a way that a lot of people might request, that people look at this and say, yes, this program, and not an American program for Americans, but a Korean program for a transnational audience, it resonates. And for somebody, especially somebody who's like, workers of the world unite, that's a great sign. There's a basis, for a symbolic basis at least, for these themes to resonate across national boundaries. And that would just be music to the ears of those who were looking for a truly non-nationally specific movement to assert labor rights and more centrally understand the struggle of labor. And in America, that that is, I mean, half the country. They say half the country, but still, a majority of the country is not going to appreciate a critique of capitalism because it's a golden term. You know, even around here in San Francisco, you talk about an entrepreneur, you might as well be talking about like apple pie or motherhood. Nobody's going to challenge entrepreneur. Cal talks about his emails all the time about like, oh yes, the entrepreneur, yeah, entrepreneurialism, that's what you want to be. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's right. It's an initiative and whatnot, but it's also, so just widely accepted that it's great to see a critique of even like a shallowish critique of capital resonating. And I think it is. I think that's what a lot of people look at. They say, we understand that there are disenfranchised and marginalized people in the world. Maybe it's capitalism. It seems like it might be capitalism, and they make it available for us as an interpretation. And the fact that people are taking that in and it's so widely popular gives me hope. It gives me hope that labor will not be the passe, boring, discussion. I was talking earlier, like the old bearded Marxist passing out Xerox copies of the Communist Manifesto, desperate for an audience. I don't know if you guys had that person in your life when you were younger. I did, but they seem desperate and marginalized. Well, this tells me that a critique of capital could become mainstream. It tells me that the symbolic array that we saw there resonated with a lot of people.
I want to get your answer, Kevin, but I have to just my response, the one thing I just want to bring back is like the problem is like you don't really feel by the end of the series like empathy for the players because they all do such horrific things to each other, right? Like it would be one thing if it's like, gosh, poor them, like they really had to suffer, but then like by the end you're like they all turn into such barbarians, such animals. Like even the financier, this guy who died second, what was his name? Jinsu? The best friend who kills himself at the end. Okay. He kills the young woman unnecessarily. Like she was gonna die and he slits her throat. Like you don't end up feeling bad for the guy. You're like, you fucking suck. Why would you do that? And so one of the problems is like, you're right, there's this like class of folks who've been fucked by the system, but then like by the end of it, you don't even feel like you want good things to happen to them because they've all turned into such animals. So I think it also just confused me. But go ahead. Why do you think it's so popular?
Well, before I answer the popular question, I mean, I think what you're just saying is absolutely correct. But then to go back, remember earlier when you said, but we're not killing people, so our position is different from the VIPs. There's something actually the director, Dong-kyung, he says, the glass ladders, he says that this was his favorite game because the only way the players, the contestants could proceed is basically when the person before them dies, because that's what proves, that like you can't go left, you have to go right or whatever. And so he says that this ladder or bridge or whatever really represents the fact that our success, all of us are, like we're stepping on other people and basically other dead people, right? And so
is that true though?
I mean, yeah, systemically,
right?
Believe
that? Is that true?
Here, I got a quick thought experiment for you from Peter Singer that's pretty famous. He says, imagine, if you will, there's a small child, 2 years old, in a puddle. We've had a lot of rain, right? And the child falls over. It's a puddle. The child is probably going to drown because they don't know what to do in even a puddle. You have $50 blue suede shoes on. Do you run out there to save the child and ruin the shoes?
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, of course. Everybody here would do that, right? So now imagine this.
Okay.
You're standing in front. Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
You're standing in front of a nice place. You see $50 blue suede shoes in the window. You're window shopping. Okay, you could buy them or you could not. Or what you could do is send that $50 to Oxfam, and they will provide mosquito nets for half a dozen children. pretty sure you're going to save at least 2 or 3 lives. Do you choose to buy the shoes?
Those are not suede.
No, they're not. I chose not to take the suede ones. But I did buy shoes. And I rationalized, I said, look, I got an interview at the University of California, Berkeley. I can't walk in there in my old beat up Keds. I have to get some new shoes, right? Well, then I'll start donating. Once I get a job, then I'll donate some of my salary. But at every time, there's always something that we're supposed to buy. There's always something where we can say, I deserve something, I earn this money, and people can die as a result. So if that thought experiment has any merit, it tells us that every time we go out and buy something, and again, this sounds like a depressing Marxist on parade here, but it's true. We could save lives with the money that we choose to buy nice things with, to buy our Netflix subscription, to buy things that are what we consider necessary for our lives. That could save a life. That's Peter Singer's thought experiment. And it's one that I have not been able to forget ever since I read it, because it follows me and plagues me. Now, are we killing people? There's the question. When we make our consumer decisions, are we killing people by not assisting those who need it?
It makes me think of that scene where they've all just finished being murdered by these faceless, nameless ghouls, and then the muscular guy kills the person who got upset at him for eating his egg, and everyone's apoplectic, how dare you kill him? You killed a man, and it was yeah, but honey, did you just see what happened? You know what I mean? And it was this. What do you think that was about? Because clearly the director was trying to show us that just human death is not in itself the thing, but seeing, and then the whole thing of when they lifted the masks, everything changed. So what did you glean from that, and what do you think we were trying to be told from their clear upsetness of having one of their own kill one of their members versus being murdered by these machines? What was that about?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think going back to what Ian was just saying, one of perhaps both the strengths and the weaknesses, simultaneously, of the series is that it shows the violence upon which our competitive society is predicated very directly, right? Through this allegory of the game where you literally have to kill your opponent to succeed, whereas in real life, it's not so clear cut, it's not so direct, right? There are layers of kind of distancing and abstraction and alienation, like Ian is saying. We don't literally kill someone with our bare hands, and yet the system that we contribute to, where that kind of sucks the life from us, does do this to other people. We just never really get to see them. And so the series kind of fails in representing the abstract nature of that system that does kill many people every day, for lack of resources or affordable medicine or whatever. So it doesn't really capture that abstract nature, but it also, I think, the stakes become very high because you see the violence that's, to sort of joke, do you remember Monty Python, the quest for the Holy Grail, there's the angry anarchist, and he's like, do you see the violence inherent in the system? So, the series actually does, show it to you very directly, but then, again, that doesn't kind of capture the abstract. So I think, what you're talking about with the kind of on the side violence, where they're in the dormitory and they're killing each other, I think what I like about that element of the game, as it were, is that it's showing, everybody hates the gangster character Doksu who you're describing because he killed someone directly, in the dormitory, or someone kills, say, the woman at the end, and we hate him for it. But that kind of off, how would you say, off the playing field, kind of off the field violence is really no different, right? And it's actually more honest in a way than the so-called rules where the appearance that everybody's playing fairly.
Right.
There's a great article I read, I have it in my notes here, I don't take the time to cite it, but that kind of describes the importance of the illusion that there's this meritocracy, that everybody sort of starts equal, and that's why the doctor gets killed.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
But there's actually, from the beginning, there was no fairness, right? Not, and in the real world, not everybody starts from the same, starting line or whatever. So I think that what I like about the normatory violence is that it's showing that despite all the kind of like machinations of the old man to produce this illusion of equality within the game, you know, that's impossible, and that the fact that they're allowed to sort of kill each other and fight at nighttime in the dormitory and so on, I think kind of speaks truth to that that impossibility. And even, you know, the climactic Squid game, they're allowed to basically, like, they don't have to actually play the game, they could just like be fighting the entire time, right? And that's kind of, I think that again speaks to in kind of honesty there, and laying bare that the violence that the whole is structured upon.
You know, on that point, I was wondering, especially with when you didn't need subtitles, you know, when you watch the series.
Yeah, I was actually wondering, did all of you watch it dubbed or did you watch it with subtitles? Because this is actually a very important difference for me. And I had, you know, somebody told me that they recently watched it dubbed.
Yeah, show of hands for those who watched it dubbed. Those who watched it with subtitles? Everyone subtitles.
So like the regular
Why would you
Netflix.
ever watch anything dubbed like ever?
This is an interesting question that it's sort of amazing that this Korean media made it in America, because, you know, studies have shown, like, you know this better than I do, that American audiences just generally don't like, you know, foreign language media, or they don't like, you know, it's just sort of harder to read subtitles, something you have to get accustomed to and so on. So I'm quite surprised that it kind of crossed that threshold.
Did you, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but did you know Korean?
Yeah.
Were there things missing? Like, what do you think was lost in the subtitle translation?
Yeah, some of there are some important differences, like specifically with Ali's character. You know, I think like when he's calling Sonu the you know, the banker, kind of the Seoul National University graduate. I don't know if you picked up on that, but he's kind of like, he represents kind of the mainstream Korean opinion, but it's sort of even like a Harvard business graduate or something. And when Ali calls him, he's actually, before, I don't know if you remember, but Sanu at one point says, like, stop calling me that, just call me this. But so what those two terms aren't really translated well, I think it just keeps saying Sanu the whole time. But actually what he's saying, like, for what Ali kind of uses to address, the honorific term he uses to address almost everybody is 사장님, which literally is like boss. It's a way to kind of refer to your boss. It's a very kind of official, it literally means like the owner of the company. And so he's calling this to everybody, but in particular, he becomes closer to someone right hand. So when he's calling him 사장님, it's almost like, you know, it's obsequious, it's just too much. And so at one point, someone says, you know, stop calling me that, just call me Hyung. And Hyung is also still, you know, Hyung was older, or someone was older than Ali. So Hyung is still kind of a form of respect to an older male between males, but that it also symbolizes certain closeness, a certain stages that has been reached in their relationship. So it's also a very endearing term. And the fact that he calls him that, I think later makes kind of the betrayal very sad and so forth. But I think those things don't really come across in translation. So that's kind of one particular moment.
Sorry, Ian, I interrupted you. You're about to respond to Kevin's earlier point, I think.
That was, but I'm very curious about the language and difference there. So, but if I could, I want to call attention to a couple other themes that I am somewhat mystified by. The first is gender, because everyone's equal. Now let's all play tug of war. Like, okay, just, you know, this seems a little bit disingenuous, and I feel like the showrunners are intentionally saying, like, okay, yeah, this is what for instance, capitalism. We all have equal opportunity, and those who work hard will succeed. This kind of fantasy and mythology of capitalism is kind of exposed. You know, it's like, we want everything to be equal here, and you violate the one principle, but it's not even, in the basic way, a practicable idea. So that's one thing I'm curious about. The second thing is the role of Christianity. That was truly mystifying to me. Like, occasionally Christianity would just pop up in iconography, and of course very explicitly in pastors, and we have that one character whose name I've lost, but was a Christian. Not a good look for Christianity.
No.
Not a good look.
No.
So I was wondering if you might be able to outline and help me understand better the role of Christianity and missionaries. At one point, I think he says, "I come from a long line of Buddhists. Get away from me." You know. So what are, is it these, kind of Jehovah's Witnesses, is that the kind of role that Christians play in society? I'm familiar.
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I didn't even anticipate having to talk about Christianity, but I think that's more important to South Korean society perhaps than to the American audience. So that's another thing that maybe it's not a language issue, but it also might get lost sort of in translation, so to speak. I mean, Christianity is very, very prevalent in South Korean society, right? In particular, kind of the Catholic tradition has a more kind of radical left-wing association, like in the 1980s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the pro-democracy region movement, as it's called. Like a lot of the Catholic priests participated, and they were very much like participating in kind of anti-government, anti-authoritarian activities. But after that, kind of from the 2000s onward, Protestantism has kind of taken over and is primarily associated with the right, so kind of the rising new rich kind of and Protestant and evangelical wing have like kind of associations. So you're starting to see really big churches that draw huge crowds and kind of have like speaker mediated churches and so on. So I think the series is kind of drawing attention to how like the collusion between kind of the business class, the new kind of rich, and this rising evangelical Christianity, in the hypocrisy in particular of the what is her name, Jiyeon, the character that the other woman, Savion, has to kill during the Marvel episode. Her father, right, was a pastor or whatever, but he's a total hypocrite, right? So kind of there's that kind of combination.
Okay, I want to get to audience questions in just a bit, a couple more minutes. I just have a couple more questions. I could sit here and talk about this forever. I'm like so fascinated by this stuff. And I talk about politics. I don't really get to talk about media, so this is really cool for me. But I feel like I want this to be an exchange. But I wanted to hint, just a quick reaction to that. I'm a pretty religious person. And the whole time I was thinking, I think a lot of people were thinking, like, if I was in this game, like, how the fuck would I like get through this thing? Like, would I like stand behind people during green light, red light, and just like, go for it? Like, would I turn into an animal? Would I turn to faith? And that character hit me really hard because I definitely would have been the guy like praying the whole time, being like, God will save me, God will take me through, da-di-da-di-da. But like when he gets up there, when he's going up the tug of war and he's praying, and you can see him during the tug of war, he's the one that's like, we're not gonna make it, it's over, like Jesus is gonna take me now. And you're like, bitch, figure this tug of war out. Like, enough about Jesus, like, we need you. There was that moment where they're like, stop praying, like, and so that was a real hit for me because I was like, there are some moments where like you need to get with the program if you're not gonna fall to your death. So that really triggered me and hit me in a big way. So that's a share. But I just have two questions. One is about the ending. So this ending, okay? So I'm sorry, honey. You gotta like you're the only one that hasn't watched So this, what do you think the director was trying to get with us with this? It turns out it's the old guy, and he's the rich overlord. What do you think the lesson, I mean, maybe what we're learning from this is it's not so clean. It's not there isn't a clear lesson, but what do you think was the purpose of ending it in that way?
Now I'll take a stab at that very quickly. It's fresh in my head, so it feels like a first draft of the interpretation. But one thing that really struck me was his comment. The old man, player one. His comment that, well, when you're really, really rich and you're really, really poor, it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
I don't think it is. Yeah. I don't think it is. But it does tell us, again, it contributes to that critique where it's like, this guy's been so rich, living on, it was very specific. It was the former sin of usury, right? It's lending out money and taking advantage of people. Strictly forbidden in actually in the Islamic tradition. The lending is very, very restricted and modified and regulated because they understand that it's socially destructive. Why? Because you have, eventually that leads very quickly to the wealth gap. Wealth gap between those who have money to loan it, and then they're, parasitically, those who need money, right? And of course, in capitalism, American capitalism, we take loans out so we can build a business and make a lot of money. But a lot of people fall behind. A lot of people fall down on that. So, you know, this guy's callous misunderstanding of, oh, I don't get any joy in life anymore because I'm so rich, and it's kind of the same as poor people, tells me that it's his pessimistic, weird kind of view of the world from being ultra rich. Like, you know, I'm not satisfied unless I have a yacht big enough to have a pool in which a yacht can be in. Now I feel complete. No, not necessarily. It's not.
And the weird thing about that, Ian, is that this is the character of all the characters that throughout the series we have the most heart for. Because we're like, this poor guy, he's got a brain tumor, and he's standing on the top of the beds and saying, no more fighting, you guys. I don't like it. He's wetting himself, and he's letting the main character, you know, survive. And you're like, this is the one guy that you're like, ah, shucks, we like him. Like, he gives us hope. And he's the main culprit. He's the one that is doing all this just to get a kick out of people with his murder. And so I left the series and I was like, I don't even know who to hate anymore. Like, he's the worst of all of them. He's worse than the fat gay guy that like wants to rape the detective. He's like even worse than that guy. And he was the guy this whole time that I was like, everyone should be nice to him. So that's why it was such a mindfuck, because you're like, you don't even get a clear villain. You're still synthesizing in the last 50 minutes that he was the culprit, and it doesn't give you that. That's why it's so unsuccessful in my mind, because you can't even hate the guy so much. And then he dies, and you're like, what the fuck? Okay.
Well, I think Manny, what you said was really interesting, and I think that again brings us to this question of like kind of the abstract nature versus kind of explicit allegorization, right? And I mean, so when you ask, like, what does that ending mean? It's actually really hard for me to answer that. The best I can come up with is the fact that like this old man, this is very simple, but he represents like sort of the typical successful CEO in South Korea, right? So South Korean capitalism sort of is dominated by what are called chaebol, which are basically these like family-owned businesses like Samsung and all of these different companies funded. These are all, like there's a select few like super rich companies that basically dominate the market, which is slightly different from, it's a little bit more sort of pluralistic in American capitalism. But so he just sort of very concretely embodies that, which throughout the series, it's always like kind of unclear, like who's behind all this, right? It's this kind of conspiratorial sense. And even when the VIPs come, like they, the people who are running it sort of are embodied in these people, but you still feel like there's sort of like the grammar of the show, like kind of the rules are still somehow unseen. And at the end, when it brings this character in, it's a way of kind of embodying or concretizing that power structure. So I think on the one hand, it successfully does represent the kind of conglomerate dominated South Korean capitalism, but then that may also be a weakness because there's no, that doesn't properly capture the abstract nature of capitalism, and that's why the question of like, is there a villain or not? I mean, one of the arguments, like, do you all remember 12 Years a Slave, the film from a few years ago? I mean, what I both loved that film, and also a close friend of mine said, like it's kind of unfair to make the slave owner like actually the sadistic character, because like you could be a nice person, and the fact that you're a slave owner is already like an indictment. So why do you need to kind of overly dramatize it with with sort of like character idiosyncrasies? And I think that's the same thing, that like our society doesn't have really villains. Like there are a few people like Colin Powell. Sorry, but like there are people who we can point out, but they are not like individually responsible for everything, right?
I can't believe that's the first person who goes there. He's the worst you can find.
Well, he certainly. I mean, Henry Kissinger is obviously worse than that.
What? Another conversation. Let's go to audience questions. Go ahead. Well, wait, were you done? I want to pick you
Well,
up.
no, I mean, again, like the
lost me
difficulty.
now being the worst person ever.
I suppose there are. I sort of like, I think of the more American foreign policy that is like very
Right, but like, wasn't Dick Cheney worse? Like, wasn't Colin Powell? Didn't you listen to the Daily last week?
Well, but, yeah, I mean, Dick Cheney worked for one administration, but Colin Powell was like sort of like consistently this
But he
American
didn't
hawk.
want to. Didn't he not want to? Anyway.
Let me just follow, because I do think that the ending, the ambiguity, the complexity that we saw there, what were they doing? They were looking out the window and they're looking at an unhoused person. And the guy was like, let's make a bet. Will somebody save him? I thought in the end, it would be like, the protagonist would go out and save himself, be like, hey, I win the bet by actually spending our money. I thought that's where we're going to go. That didn't happen. Right, which is interesting, but they did have somebody come out and save him, and he was like, looked at him as he died, like, oh, I hope you didn't die before you saw that, so that he could feel like humanity is worth investing in, and that's why I think this show is more about empathy than it is capitalism per se.
Yeah, and in a way, it like gets close to that tropey American cinematic thing where, like, against all odds, even though everyone else is being struck by bullets, this person somehow is going. I just saw James Bond, and like literally everyone else is getting hit by a bullet, but he is somehow like goes to the top of the tower and saves the day. In this show, like there are moments where it starts to take you down that road, like the detective that like sneaks in and almost gets caught, doesn't get caught, and then at the end, he gets murdered by his own brother. And it doesn't have the signal to send it. And so there's this like, I don't know. I'm doing so much right now.
Season 2.
All right, sorry, but I did went on too long. Questions. And also, like, I want to hear from you all, why do you think it's so popular? Why do you think it's so important? Go ahead.
Speaking of the policeman, I'm wondering if you guys would talk about the role of like the Korean government in this. Like, I was really interested in the line when the brother was saying like the police are kind of calm, they don't care, and like wondering if you could unpack that a little bit more because they're notably very absent.
Role of the Korean government, the line about the police are going to come, they don't care. We'll talk about that.
Okay, yeah, that's a wonderful question. I'm so glad you mentioned this because I think Squid Game is really unique in its representation. Usually, like kind of the social realist drama genre typically always pits like the bad capitalists against the police, and the police are like sort of there to catch the bad, corrupt, kind of business people. And so it's usually Korean media tends to portray the state as kind of the good, force in society that's sort of like protecting against the excesses of just particular bad apple capitalists, right? And you see this in a broad range of Korean media. And so this show is really unique in demonstrating the ineffectiveness of the state, right? But at the same time showing how this sort of like corrupt system dominates. And so I really like the fact that basically the whole the kind of like the throughout we're rooting for the police officer to somehow like uncover this, and like if only he can get the news out, then somehow this terrible game will be someone will have to stop it. And the fact that like he fails and actually it just keeps going, I think is much more realistic, right? It's much more kind of adequate to the way our everyday lives work, where the police, if anything, the police are on the same side as the people who run the game, as opposed to somehow like intervening to stop it, right? So I think it's quite unique in Korean media, which again, going back to kind of the conglomerate nature of South Korea. I mean, one leftist newspaper in South Korea calls South Korea the Republic of Samsung. So it's like, like the Korean government is basically, in cahoots with these conglomerates and typically bails them out and protects their interests. So the idea of the police officer versus the kind of the capitalist is a kind of ideology produced by the Korean media culture industry. So thank you.
Next question, Kojin, and then we'll go to you next.
Go ahead first.
Oh, okay. This is for the stage fighter. So earlier you talked about the singer's thought experiment as kind of evidence that we step over people to succeed. When you described that thought experiment, that reminded me of the trolley problem. I'm sure you're familiar. So I was wondering if I
Describe it to me.
the trolley problem.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I was thinking, let's say you had $50 and there's a trolley about to run over 5 people, and you could pay $50 to make it run over one person instead. So that's the way I kind of thought about the problem when you like pulled to me. So to me, I kind of view the unwillingness to pay $50 to donate $50 to save 2 or 3 lives as more of a problem of a lack of immediacy of the impact. If I can sacrifice my blue suede shoes to save a child, it's an immediate impact. I would definitely do that. But saving 2 or 3 children in a continent away, it lacks immediacy for me. So I view it as less valuable. And like that's the kind of way I kind of framed that through the trolley problem. So I was wondering if like, do you think that line of reasoning is like incorrect? Is it still the case that not donating $50 is primarily due to my willingness to step over these 2 or 3 children in Africa so I can succeed?
The Singer experiment or the thought experiment, again, I give credit to Peter Singer for coming up with this. I just kind of ride on his coattails. But it's compelling because it illustrates a dominant feeling of privatism in which that informs everything from I don't want to pay taxes to I don't want to donate to I don't want to go see my in-laws. It's what do we do for others and how other-centered we are. And it's I think a fair argument that American society has taught us to embrace privatism, to have a sense of entitlement to our earnings, so what we are individual atomized earners, and then you demonstrate your worth by purchasing things and demonstrating your individual self-worth that way. So that's for me the purpose of the Singer experiment is to illustrate how all of us are involved in a system of commodities and in a system where we privilege ourselves and some of our luxuries over anything else. Now, your thinking in terms of the experiment of like minimizing death, right? To what do we do here? Should it be one person versus another, or a set of people, or some people being more worthy of going on versus others? And this is the kind of thinking that we do. And with the thought experiment, your response is I think an appropriate one, because out of sight, out of mind, right? But if the Singer is a philosopher, he's an ethicist. And so every time I come to that, like, well, why don't I donate right now instead of buying these shoes? Well, there is no immediate importance, like the child falling, and of course you need help. But what he asks us to do is to think more broadly about what is the worth of a life. And because we see somebody dying, does that make that life more worthy of continuing? So philosophically, we have not really come to a position where we can say one life is worth more than another. Therefore, our reluctance to donate, our reluctance to support, somebody because they're not in our field of vision, again, it's not philosophically justifiable. And that's the struggle that we have, right? It's the struggle that sometimes we deal with in these other thought experiments, like the trolley experiment and others, which actually has a real world consequence. I have friends working on autonomous vehicles, and of course, me coming from philosophy, I want to be like, well, okay, you've got 3 small children over here, and you've got 4 old women over here. Who's going to die when your car has to decide which where to divert its momentum? And they always laugh at me and give me some techno babble. I'm confused, and I say like, let's talk later when I figure this out. But yeah, I mean, it's an important question. But again, the reason I bring up the Singer experiment is to illustrate how the culture or cult of privatism has infected even, say, the economic left in America. We fundamentally do believe that we deserve luxuries before other people deserve to live, and we just don't see it because of the, as you said, the mediation, the mediation that goes on between it. And I think this show does a great job of playing with how we empathize, right down to, again, as spectators, the characters we want to live and the characters we're okay with dying. Right? Well, why? Why is one life worth more than another? Because they exhibit antisocial behavior, and so we're like this, almost the herd element in us, the apes in us are like, oh, they seem like people that are worthy of life, and if one's going to die, well, it's going to be the antisocial one that I'm okay dying, right? And this is the trolley experiment. We get to decide as spectators in this low stakes environment, because it's fiction, we're betting, on those who are more socially adjusted. And again, I think the cleverest thing about the show is to reveal the role of empathy and how our empathy dries up at certain moments, and when and why doesn't. And of course, then we can bring in the capitalism and say, is capitalism allowing our empathy wells to dry up very quickly, or justifying us, allowing us to have thin rationalizations why some people should die and some shouldn't? Oh, they're out of our field of vision, so they can die. How do we sort out this question of who should live and who should die, and what is the role of empathy? These are the wonderful philosophical questions that the Squid Game really, I think, allows us to think through. Good question.
I'm gonna move to the next question, but I think part of what you just said there struck me is maybe that's another reason why it's so popular. Is what happened is people needed to wrestle with these questions with others. I found myself bringing it up a lot, like, what do you think, or what's it about, or what does it mean? And I think it probably helped the thing spread. Like, I remember it was at Fort Mason for Fleet Week, and the planes were flying up, and all we could talk about, even though there was like a air show, was like how crazy Squid Game was. And so I think because it didn't give us clean answers, we all had to wrestle with it within our friend group and our colleagues, and that helped kind of spread it. Go ahead. And then Coach, and I'll have you go right after.
Okay.
My question was about kind of who the VIPs are supposed to represent in like a global context, because it seemed like they seemed distinctly American, right? They had this like these pig masks and American accents. So this being, I don't exactly understand the background of how the show was made. Was it made specifically for a Korean audience, and then Netflix decided to like spread it to the rest of the world? Because I think that like plays in heavily into how what we're supposed to take away from the show, whether the VIPs are supposed to be like Americans and there's some like American hegemony thing going on, or if it's just rich people in general.
I'll let you answer, but I do think one of the VIPs was speaking Chinese. So I kind of took it as like there was that kind of oil baron type who unfortunately also clearly had some homosexual predilections, and I was kind of annoyed by that because it played into the whole gay man as a villain thing. But there was a VIP that was speaking Chinese, so I don't. He could have been American, obviously, speaking Chinese. But what do you think?
Yeah, I can take this one. That's a great question. Thank you so much for that. And I think there's really two questions there. The first one, who are the VIPs meant to represent? I think you may need to point that out, because I was going to mention there is a Chinese tycoon. So I think that they are meant to represent the global elite at present. Those of you who mansplain these statistics, but I mean, you probably know like the three richest individuals control like the equivalent amount of wealth as like the poorest 50 countries or something like that, right? And then like if you so that's like the top 1%, but then like the top 10% controls what, like 80% of the world's wealth. So there is, I mean, like wealth inequality is concretized in particular wealthy individuals, and I think the VIPs are basically those people, right? Like there are 10 people in the world who basically, like, if they gave up all their wealth, you know, the world would be twice as good as it is now, essentially. So I mean, as abstract as capitalism is globally, like it is embodied in particularly filthy rich people, and I think that in a certain way, that's who the VIPs are meant to represent. Now, without disagreeing with what Ian was saying earlier about like we are essentially also the VIPs in our kind of voyeurship in watching the show, but that is slightly different. The question of like who was the audience meant to be, or like what when the series was first created, I think this is also a really great question, because from what I've read, the director intended to pitch this as a film originally, but it was just like it was too much and it wasn't really received well. It was just kind of too crazy and too bizarre, so he felt like he would flesh it out through a series. And he actually first pitched it in 2008. And he failed. It was rejected at that time. And he says, like, I think the way he accounts for the success now is like essentially the escalating immiseration of global, kind of populations. That there's been a great, the upward distribution of wealth and kind of growing inequality has contributed to a certain receptivity in the audiences for this material at present. But I want to point out the important, like maybe discrepancy between us watching it in America versus the Korean reception, because I think you could almost think of this show as being originally intended for Korean audiences, and that the Korean perception of this global elite business class is going to be slightly different, I think, from the American one, because we're essentially at the top of the world, right? Like we're behind the gun barrel, whereas like the Koreans or other other nations, they're the ones facing American military and financial power. And that's something I think that's easy to forget when we're doing this like empathy movement, where like, oh, American audiences can resonate with these similar themes of inequality because we also face them. Yeah, that is true. But then like the very unequal power dynamic between the United States and South Korea, I think, is felt by basically all South Koreans. I mean, they feel this every day, that like America is this that South Korea is essentially a colony of the United States, right? And that reality, I think, gets embodied in the VIP characters, like the way that this global audience can just watch our Korean suffering, right? And so what does that mean for us? When we're rooting for particular, going back to Ian's question about voyeurism, like when we're rooting for particular characters, what are the ethics of like allowing us to just be okay with like watching these brown people getting killed on screen, right? Like the kind of the racial international dimensions of the show, I think, are very important. That like for us, we don't think of it in terms of like Americans killing Koreans like they were in the Korean War, right? Like that doesn't, but I mean, those overtones are going to just be so obvious to any Korean watching the show, right? So as much as we can empathize, because a lot of Americans are dead and so on, with the contestants, I think there's also a dynamic whereby, we as American audiences are closer to the VIPs, I guess, than an ordinary Korean watching the show. So I think I would want us to kind of pause and reflect on that.
Well, I really didn't even go there, but I really appreciate that global contextualization. Thank you. I promise you guys I'd keep it kind of short tonight, but I'm really enjoying this conversation. So is it okay if we get like a few more questions, maybe 2 more, and then we'll call it? Is that all right? All right, Kojin.
I really liked your point about the sort of the combination of the social realist show and the K-horror, J-horror. And that just made me think of a wildly successful, I think in the 90s or late 80s, a J-horror that took on sort of social realist themes, Battle Royale, right? It's sort of high school students have to fight each other to the death for a game. It has a lot of the very similar elements as Squid Game, and sort of, I guess my question is about the continued cultural relevance of Squid Game, because as we saw with Battle Royale, it was really important in the moment, but then now the way that it's been carried into this current moment is through video games targeted towards children like Fortnite and Warzone, and wildly popular commercial hits for recreation's sake, not exactly for hard-hitting thought, but for recreation. Do you see that happening with Squid Game in the same way as Battle Royale? I mean, around the world, people are hosting their own Squid Games. So food for thought. Yeah, in Italy, there's a massive Squid Game in Rome. That's happening.
What does that mean?
I hope it's in jest and recreation, but I think it's to basically do basically a mass game thing. As for a prize. London is hosting one as well.
I mean, did you mean to ask me specifically, or because I got the last one?
Sure. I mean,
okay.
I didn't.
I haven't watched Battle Royale, but is this the one that is currently there? There's a question of plagiarism, right, going on. So is Battle Royale the source material?
I think so.
Okay,
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, but I mean, regardless, like, I'll be sort of like neutral here in that jurisdiction. But I mean, what I think the plagiarism case shows is that there's a clear precedent, right? Like that people have been interested in games for a long time, right? Game shows and And it also, I think, reflects on reality TV to a certain extent, right? And I've never understood, like, ever since I was a kid and the MTV, what is it, Real World, like, first came out, I was like, why, why would I want to watch, like, just other people living? Like,
Wait,
I
are
never
you kidding
understood.
me?
Daddy
from New Orleans. Hello.
And so it wasn't until the Truman Show, which was actually like kind of a parody, like showing how this is a critique and actually reality TV is like kind of dystopian. Like then I was like, oh, I get it. But that was only like kind of negatively, right? That I finally figured out the attraction. But that hasn't gone away. I mean, I think all of us are still very much interested in game shows and I mean, so what is it about games? I mean, the fact that it appears like it's somehow outside of our everyday mundane world, right? Like that there's sort of excitement and that, again, there's the illusion of kind of equality or something, like when you're competing in a game, it feels like the stakes maybe are different or it feels like more fair than the real world competition. So I've not quite understood that. But then there's also, you know, the dystopian genre of the Hunger Games and kind of other like violent game shows, sort of hybrid genres that have, you know, Squid Game has often been compared to. I mean, what is the fascination? I mean, this is also a question I have for all of you. Like, why is this such a kind of affective genre for people? I mean, I don't quite know the answer except to say that it's, I think, like, this is my understanding that people tend to forget their own position when they watch this. Like that this is a fantasy, but like Ian said this earlier, his phrase low stakes, right? That there's no stakes. Like we can kind of enjoy this blood sport, but it doesn't really have anything to do with our real everyday lives. And I think Squid Game doesn't allow that at all. Like, right, Squid Game kind of shows it in your face that this is actually what your real life is like. And whereas I think most like game shows, most kind of series or media in the game show genre don't do that. They kind of enforce this disconnection and kind of this fantasy world, and maybe that's what allows people to enjoy it. And so I wonder, like, why Squid Game wouldn't be less popular, because it's kind of throwing it in your face, but then perhaps there's something else going on there that makes people want to see it.
Yeah, I mean, there was one of the critiques, and the last question, one of the critiques was that we all want to believe that what this show does at the end is make us want to fight capitalism or fight the rich overlords. But in truth, when no one's actually looking, the reaction has been like, you see this happening and it's fear, and you're like, whoa, I want to make sure I'm not one of those people. You know what I mean? Like, what do I gotta do to make sure that I'm never gonna get into that place? So like, how much money do I need to make? How do I like never be in debt? Like, I want those blue suede shoes because that really sucks. And I feel like if I had to guess, most people, the like deep down, like what they got from it was like a kick in the tuchus to like make sure that they never get to a place where they're gonna need to go back into the game, versus what we all, I think, wanna say, which is like, yeah, like, fuck the system, like, no, like, cause I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, that I had more fear than fight. And that's just me being honest.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are gonna respond that way. And this is in part why I have looking at it from a critical media analysis point of view, when we look at the representations, we have, not necessarily people making the wisest choices, ending up in debt, and that puts them in this situation. And so it is easy for those of us who have managed to avoid incredible amounts of debt, crushing debt, and certainly we're not betting on the horses, we're not forgetting our daughter's birthday. We, with the exception, I think, of like the North Korean refugee and the Ali, the immigrant, we have a lot of easy ways to say, that's not like me. I wouldn't bet on the horses. I'm not going to lose my money that way. And so then we can distance ourselves a little bit. And that means we're not looking at a documentation of the injustices of capitalism. We're looking at people who make bad choices. So it's not the system that's at fault. It's the culture of the people that make those choices.
Right, there's that criminal. I mean, I forget it, like the muscular criminal guy. And you're like, you are a bad person. You're like a gang lord man. And anyway, last question. That's it. We good? Did you already ask a question? You did, right?
I had a follow-up, but he
Okay. Yeah. Oh, right. Okay. Go ahead. And then did you have a question too?
In the back.
Yeah, sorry. I couldn't see. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, okay, so you touched upon how, it's kind of a weird one, but, the Westerners were pretty fucking villainous, in this, and so, but watching this, you know, my Western friends are like, oh yeah, that's who I like identify with because we're Western. Like the cultural barrier is kind of surpassed by the show because of the concept of debt is so universally relatable. But do you think that between different cultures, there's a completely different reception of the show? Like Westerners would watch it, and I'm assuming here, but would not relate to those Western characters. But do you think that different cultures would be like, oh, Westerners, or what is the significance of cultural differences in watching this show? And if there are differences, does it really matter in comparison to the relatability of the burden of debt? That was really convoluted, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's pretty massive there. You know, relating it all to debt on top of that. But you certainly, I think you make a great point that debt is something a lot of us, especially in industrialized Western, not Western necessarily, but industrialized capitalist situations, usury, right, as we mentioned earlier. That's an important thing, and people have suffered with that. And so there is kind of, I think, almost a transnational structure of resentment, that you can tap into certainly by talking about debt, because all of us can relate to it. So maybe there's a transnational element there. But then what happens, and this I think you mentioned earlier about English. Whenever English is spoken, and I'm looking at a Korean film, like the films of Bong, right, the Parasite, very famous, but one of my favorites was, and when I come back to over and over again, was The Host from 2006 when that came out. And what was the role of the English language moments in that? Of course, I tuned in right away when English is spoken, thinking about cultural oppression, the Korean history of the Korean War, right? What's happening there? U.S. military presence. These are things I'm tuned into, and I'm interested in how artists are going to bring that up. And that moment right at the beginning is the American. I don't know if you guys have seen the film at the very beginning. The host. This I think it was some sort of captain or something, says, go ahead, just dump out all that formaldehyde into the river. And the Korean subordinate, he was American who said that, and the Korean subordinate is just like, oh, that goes right to the river, maybe we should do that. The guy's like, just do it, these bottles are dusty. And it's an irrational thing, but it's the first moment we have the presence of an American here, is that of an abusive colonial relationship to Korea. And then the phrase, the host, takes on a whole new meaning. Right? A lot of people think of the host and like, oh, that's the monster, is that right? But no, it's Korean society playing host to this kind of this horror show of American militarism so there is this colonial element. And whenever I'll say, I can only speak for myself, just like you said earlier, your own impression. I don't necessarily relate to that guy. Who I relate to is the subordinate being bossed around and his resistance, because that's the structure of it. We're supposed to look at that guy, that captain, and say, you're a callous ass. Don't pour formaldehyde in there because the bottles are dusty. It's created in a way that I think, like debt, it transcends the abuse, the colonial relationship transcends, especially ethnic identification or even cultural identification. And I'm speaking for myself, but I imagine a lot of people in that narrative are going to look at that and say, that American is an idiot. I don't identify with that. And I identify with somebody of a different cultural background. I identify with the South Korean guy who's being bossed around. So again, transcending kind of national allegiance or any sort of kind of patriotic identification with all the Western characters. I really don't identify with the Western characters, many of them in the films of Bong, for instance. So I'd imagine that when you see injustice is something that transcends identification with specific, kind of ethnicities. I don't know if I'm getting at your point directly, but
Kevin, final word of the evening.
Well, I mean, I agree 100% with what Ian was saying. I couldn't have said it better. I think the only kind of addition I would have would be to think about this word culture, right? And the way, in your question, how is the word culture kind of mystifying these geopolitical relationships that maybe, like just because someone is Korean or American doesn't necessarily determine their politics or their perspective, right? And so potentially an American audience could sympathize with a Korean character and vice versa. And I think that's an important reflection. And the other thing again to remember that there's one of the VIPs is Chinese, right? So it's not really grounded necessarily in nationality or language, but kind of a question of does this outsider have the interests of the ordinary kind of suffering Korean or not, right? And or the Pakistani, right? It's not only Koreans that's raised in the series. So I think it's powerful and kind of the series also like demystifies this term culture in thinking about the direct geopolitical relations.
Well, first of all, I just want to give a round of applause to our professors. Responding to a cold email, and for Precious and Tomas for finding them, and for spending time in your busy work schedule this evening to be a part of this conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and like I said, I mainly talk to politicians and bureaucrats, so it's really cool to talk to professors about media and culture. I feel out of my lane and I like it. So thank you for that, and thank you all for being here. Some of you have been here since 6 o'clock. So all stars, love it, love the learning. I'm losing my mind. So two events I want to put. It's hard. I was thinking, it's like, which events would this crowd be interested in? The future of Judaism? Winning the drug war? Probably not. But the CEO of Eventbrite is coming on Thursday. Which is this billion-dollar company, all about gathering and ticketing, and her name is Julia Hart. She's awesome, and she is a CEO of a big company. So, and in the media kind of social world. So she's awesome. So definitely come Thursday evening to hear the conversation on the future of gathering with Julia Hart. And then I want to pitch. It is our 3rd year anniversary next Saturday. And from 2 to 5, we're going to have a political carnival, calling it Blue in 22. There will be an alpaca, a human alpaca, a real alpaca. We're going to try to park it to a petting zoo. We're going to have balloon animals. We're going to have a dunk tank, and we're going to dunk politicians. Seriously, it's going to be awesome. So you can get your Marxist energy out and dunk some politicians, and that's one thing you can do. And all of you, please come. It'll be next Saturday, and it's a way for us to celebrate our anniversary and 1 year out from the 2022 midterm elections. So in very Manny style, we're going to be celebrating, but also being sober about all the work we need to do. Not too sober, but sober about what we need to do to win that election. If you liked what you heard tonight, you can support us by becoming a Manny sponsor. It's $36 a month. It is both quite capitalist and also somewhat anti-capitalist in that this small business is being funded mainly by a community of individuals making small donations monthly to keep us afloat. So if you want to be a part of that vision, which I'm super proud of, you can become a sponsor. Welcome to Mannys.com, or you can find Precious or myself afterwards. It's very simple, very easy. And anything else? Oh, exit through this back door because we've already closed the front. Yeah, like fuck Squid Game. Have a good night, everyone.